competition, but that they share certain types of mentalities and also they shared certain types of policies. Can you talk a little bit about what Hoover did, or the Hoover administration did that was wrong, and then how FDR either changed that or adapted it or just kind of glommed onto it?
Well, it's amazing how much temperament matters. And Roosevelt was said to have a first-class temperament. Hoover,
what did that mean?
What did that mean? Well, I'll get to that. But in Hoover's case, he was a good man, and he was electing him was like electing Bill Gates or electing Mike Bloomberg, or electing, let's see, some other, maybe Ross Perot, some other capitalist figure. President. We said, the country said, we want a businessman to rationalize our country. And there was nothing wrong with some aspects of that, but he had an unfortunate...
And he wasn't just a businessman, he was also an engineer.
He was an engineer, yes. But he was a control freak. That was the temperament problem. So Hoover would rather have control effectively as president than do what was right. That's a harsh thing to say, but you see it happening over and over again. He also...
did people wanted that in 1928, though? I mean, that makes sense. You could say, okay, I want a control freak after everything goes to hell.
They didn't even think it would ever go to hell.
But why were, in 1928, why were people looking for an engineer who could control things, who was famous for, what, helping flood victims and, just creating large-scale...
I don't think they thought of him at the point as a control freak. They thought he was... Let's get that private sector something that he has, that Gates has, or Steve Jobs, or the Google founders have. But let's get Brin for president. Let's somehow make that happen in government.
Romney?
A little, right? So let's somehow move that thing over here without realizing it just doesn't go over. Government is a different animal, and he did also have this enormous talent at organizing humanitarian efforts. And we have our recent flood so much in our minds. There was an analogous flood, a terrible flood, in 1927, which Hoover managed. So that helped to elect him. That pitched him over.
And he was Commerce Secretary.
And he was Commerce Secretary. But when the crash happened, he did some bad things. One was he called business together and said, don't drop wages or prices. And therefore, he did not give business a free rein to handle what was happening to them, which was this downturn. And effectively, the choice was for them to close. They were going to do what the leader said. He signed the Smoot-Hawley tariff law.
Was that unprecedented, where a president would... I mean, one of the interesting things that we should talk about is the kind of underlying political and economic assumptions of the 20s and 30s versus now, which I think have changed substantially, even if policies haven't. But was it unheard of for a president to call business leaders together and say, look, I can't really do this legally yet, but I want you not to drop wages. I don't want you to fire anybody. I don't want you to... I mean, had that happened before?
It was less heard of. But when you look at this crash, you see it in contradistinction to the early crash at the beginning of the decade, which was a sharp contraction. So unemployment changes, percentage, everything very fast. And in that contraction, they more or less left the economy alone. So this was different.
Okay, and what happens is, I mean, if there's a crash, businesses are going to shut down. They might reduce wages. They might fire some people, but they do what they can to
He didn't like that compromise. So but not to harp on just that. There's also he signed a bad tariff, which sent a terrible international signal. And this is where it was in the Republican platform to have tariffs. Republicans like tariffs at that point. It was wrong, but they did. So
why did they?
Why did they? Because they had the misunderstanding that it was good for business. It's not good for business generally. It's just good for the certain businessman who has the influence with the congressman. So that's how it came about. But he probably knew better. He had lived in London. He had lived in Asia. He was a man who had generated significant economic growth through globalization. This was a period very much analogous to ours, the 20s, and I think that's my next book, the 20s. It was a wonderful period in terms of growth and people getting things they hadn't got before from strange places. He did live in that London, that international London. So, and he had 1,000 professors write to him saying, don't sign this tariff, it's bad. Smoot-Hawley, even some from his own university, Stanford. And yet he signed it.
Was that kind of unprecedented? I mean, to have a mass of academics actually trying to influence policy in a very direct way?
No, I don't think so. But it was certainly strong, relatively strong. So there he was, he signed that, many other not so great things that he did. One thing that Hoover gets blamed for that he doesn't deserve blame for is people say, oh, he ought to have spent it as a Keynesian would, and the government would have made the economy grow. But we want to remember when we say that the government was very small. It was smaller than the federal government, smaller than the states and the localities. It was 2 or 3%, or like that. 3.5. So he
of gross domestic product.
Gross domestic product.
Now
so
it's about 18. Or,
it runs 18, 20. We often talk about this, but just the federal government. So this idea that the mighty government could, through spending, change the country is a false memory, or a false retrospective.
And at that point, the government wasn't even keeping these statistics, right?
Less. They didn't like to keep the unemployment statistics because they didn't want to have a political football. And maybe they were right about the political football aspect. The states kept some data. And Frances Perkins, who would later become Roosevelt's labor secretary.
And the first woman
cabinet member jousted with Hoover because she pulled out her data, her New York data, and she was very interested in having data, and maybe it was relatively accurate, and she said, your data is are not good, Mr. President, and it was all over the Times for months.
And I mean, Perkins was from New York, as was obviously Roosevelt. And New York, you stress, I think it's hard for people now, and I'm from New York, so I like to read this, but New York was more than twice as big as any other state in terms of electoral votes. It was a huge population magnet, et cetera, right? So to speak from New York
was the California. New York turned elections. So yes, it had the most. And Roosevelt had done very well, won an election there as governor. So she was his advisor, and they did all the things that they wanted to do in the federal government on the New York level first. So they have different programs and so on. And the thesis of the book is that Hoover and Roosevelt are alike. And also many advisors at the time noticed this. They said, oh, we just did what the Hoover team would have done anyway, or we just did what we had done formerly in New York. So the idea that Roosevelt alone did this stuff, I think there was a whole progressive movement.
So you have Hoover, among other things, telling businesses they can't adjust in response to an economic downturn, signing Smoot-Hawley, which not only closes off imports coming in, but it effectively means that American goods can't be exported. At the Federal Reserve level, how old was the Fed at that point?
The Fed was young. It had been founded in the teens. They didn't really know what they were doing. Neither Roosevelt nor Hoover understood that the country was in a deflation. They were having a money drought. The bank problems were a large factor too, and you get into a whole theology. I don't think it's so important here which aspect of the money drought or the bank problems made it so much worse than the international factor. There were depressions in other places too. This global contraction was part of it. But I don't think they really understood what was going on with money, or that you could create more money. They were in the gold standard culture. But there was a professor who I came to know and like in the period, was Irving Fisher, and he would go around to them and say, basically, there must be more money. And towns certainly knew it, because in the book you'll see pictures of the script that they created. They made their own money. They manufactured it. And this kind of
what the one in Salt Lake was the Valor.
And and it often had a moral component. In Salt Lake, they had a currency called the Valor, and that's a Mormon area. And one of the reasons Mariner Eccles, who later became the Fed chairman, fared so well, and he rescued a lot of banks, just like in the movies. He bluffed at the window, and the teller bluffed, and the people behaved and went away, and the bank did not collapse. One reason that happened was the moral element in the fake money, which was not Eccles, but somebody else's, but also in the Mormon culture of the bank. The Mormons listened to other Mormons, and when a Mormon told you not to withdraw your money, you would think twice. Were
they saying don't withdraw your money because it's still in here, or were they saying don't withdraw your money because that'll just destroy everything?
I think that it's always bluffing, so it's somewhere in between, right?
That's
you
really
say everything is fine. It's your nerves that cause the